All right, so the title of my presentation is Top Front Right Perspective, Translations in Model Space. And this top front right perspective refers to the four quadrants in the default view of Rhino. Because what I'm going to talk about today is a paradigm shift I've been seeing from drawings to models. And this is a shift that I think was accelerated in many ways by the COVID pandemic, but was certainly not caused by the pandemic. I think it was in motion long before that. And you might say, are we really in a post-drawing paradigm? It seems like there are plan views, section views, axonometric views, and so forth that we see proliferating on social media, in design publications. When we were on Zoom, they were shared on screen. Now we're back in person, they're printed. But what I would suggest is that most of these are not actually drawings. They are images of models. And the students in the room probably know the workflow I'm referring to, that you build the digital model and then you use a make 2D command or you use a clipping plane section to generate the line work from that model, which is very different than constructing a drawing with vectors. These, for instance, are straight renderings at a V-Ray. This is maybe the extreme case where there's not a single line in any of these. They look like plans, but they are in fact models that have been rendered in a top view. These were created in collaboration with Nick Olson as part of a UCare project, where we were looking at certain compositional relationships in the plan. But the point here is to point out this difference between what is a drawing versus what is an image of a model that might have a planimetric view. When we think about this in practice and in the construction industry, we might think of something like building information modeling, where you have a virtual simulacra of every single nut and bolt and pipe that's in a building. And all of the stakeholders, whether they are architects, engineers, consultants, clients, they have direct and immediate access to that proposed building, right? It's not requiring the translation of a plan or a section. When you look at a plan, it doesn't look like the building necessarily. So there's an immediacy within BIM. And we might also see a correlation with the immediacy, the direct illustration of a building's effects and qualities in photorealistic rendering software, like Lumion, Inkscape, which make it very easy. You can effortlessly churn out these photorealistic views that are somewhat cheesy, but nonetheless present a direct illustration of what the building should look like. And so seeing this shift from drawing and representational translation that comes with drawing towards modeling, I can't help but feel a sense of loss for all of the discourse and themes that were built around the idea of representational translation. People like Robin Evans or Massimo Scolari, Paul Emmons, who would talk about drawing not just as a way to communicate to builders. So for them, drawing wasn't a neutral conduit for spatial ideas, but instead it was a creative space, a space to expand the imagination, and one could even begin to exploit the slippages between a drawing and a building and use that as a generative design methodology in its own right. But rather than being overly nostalgic for an era of drawing, what I'm actually interested in is how some of this discourse on representational translation can be ported over into the paradigm of digital modeling and of image production more generally. And so what I'm going to show today are some experiments that deal with rendering and try to build a criticality with rendering. Most of these were undertaken during the pandemic, the years teaching online and so forth, but I think they have applications that would extend beyond the pandemic. So for instance, here you're seeing you'll see a series of renderings that I developed within my own work, and then I'll show how that folded into the teaching. I'm going to talk mostly about the representational ideas, the way in which these are composed in frames as opposed to the content of these renderings. But much of the content were projects that I had worked on previously with UCare students. This one in particular with Scott Lafferty. We'll also see some projects that Nick Olson worked on, Geneva Sincula, and Austin Riggins. So if I forget to point them out later, credit due to the students on those UCare projects. But an image like this, we're seeing this form three different ways. And when Scott and I were working on it, we talked about it as a rock-like form. And so the idea is on the far right, you're seeing a rendering of a physical model sitting on a photography backdrop. You see the shadow there, presumably from a photography lamp. And then on the screen, you're seeing two other views of that same object. On the left, we might imagine that to be a resulting output from that photography session. But then on the right, we're seeing a scale figure in the image there on the screen. And so there's a different relationship to the form. We begin to understand a certain notion of scale and size of that object. At the same time, if we look outside of the laptop screen, there's all sorts of other artifacts that we recognize and understand their scale, whether it's the push pins down in the bottom right or the laptop itself, the USB cord. There are these scale figures that are kind of standing amongst the USB cord. And if we think about those scale figures belonging to that object on the photography backdrop, then our understanding of its size changes, right? The object seems smaller there than how it appears on the screen with the scale figure. And so there is this ambiguity of scale that I'm developing in the image, and in fact trying to exploit this collapse of scale that comes with this paradigm of digital modeling. Because in the paradigm of drawing, there's a stability to scale. Let's say you have 1/8 of an inch equals a foot section drawing. That's always going to be looking at volumes of space, whereas 1/2 of an inch equals a foot section drawing is probably going to be looking at a detail, how a handrail connects to a wall section. And so there's a stability to how those scales operate in the drawing, and there's also a certain level of resolution of thought that maps onto those scales. This is all upended by the paradigm of digital modeling, whether you think of the BIM model or a student's model, where you might be looking at the building from an exterior elevational view from far away, and a quick scroll of the mouse, all of a sudden you're inside looking at a detail. And there's a radical, seamless shift of scales there. And so thinking about the implications of what that means for design is something I'm trying to unpack in an image like this. Now, it's one thing for someone who understands scale to be celebrating those ambiguities here. It's another thing for teaching beginning design students to understand scale. And so I'm going to come back to this idea later and talk about how I've developed particular exercises in the second year studios that are meant to create scale through the digital model. But you see the general technique for these experimental renderings, and that is to render these projects as if they are physical models in a space. So these, again, are projects that Scott Lafferty worked on through UCARE, or a series of precedent models that Caleb Lawrence worked on. And I'm certainly not the first person to render in this way, what I would call a mise-en-scene approach to rendering. Here we're seeing a number of examples from Gideon Schwartzman, Nima Studio, Perry Culper, Jennifer Bonner. And I would say the overarching theme here is to expose the artifice of representation. None of these are trying to trick you into thinking this is what the building will look like. They are not trying to imitate or directly illustrate those qualities and effects. Instead, they're calling attention to their own artifice. So if we look at the Perry Culper image in the bottom left, it's even zooming out from the content to show the stage set that was used to create the rendering. So we're seeing the light, a chair that perhaps the photographer would be sitting in, but all of that is part of the rendering itself. Gideon Schwartzman was perhaps the first person I saw using this technique very effectively in his master's thesis at MIT. And so you can see in the top left image there, I just love the way in which the Snickers wrapper and the Pokey Sticks packaging makes its way into the graphic character of the architecture itself, which almost becomes disguised towards the middle of the image. As I was working on these renderings, I was also thinking about ways in which I could make specific references back to the history of drawing. So an image like this, for instance, is framed frontally looking at a wall, which means that even though these drawings pinned up on the wall are texture mapped in the software, they're essentially orthographic. They don't have any of the perspectival distortions we might associate with a rendering, and instead we can read them as true plans. We don't know the scale necessarily, but they're not distorted. And even models sitting on a table there begin to approximate a true elevation of a building. A similar idea now looking down aerially onto a work table where we have these gray model bases, and called out in what's, can't quite tell, but it's a dark red, are these plans. And so again, they are using this particular view to create a true orthographic plan, but putting it in a much more casual setting. And the casualness of this setting, as if we're entering into the design studio in mid-production, allows for certain tricks and techniques to emerge. So for instance, here the model you're seeing on the right belongs to this model base. It's been rotated over and laid on its side, which creates the effect of a worm's eye axonometric, which we could associate with Choisy in the 19th century or someone like James Stirling in the 20th century. It's absorbing the utility of that drawing, but now doing it in a much more playful, casual manner. Here we're seeing a model that's in various pieces, almost like it hasn't been glued together yet, which we could think of the exploded axonometric, a drawing that is about emphasizing the pieces and the parts rather than the unity of the whole. Again, I'm not talking about the content, why it would be interesting or important to look at gas stations, because I'm trying to focus only on the representation and developing more critical approaches to rendering. Here we can almost begin to get an experiential view. The camera's not quite at the eye level of those scale figures, but it's close enough that we can think about what it might be like to approach these structures or to sit inside of one of them, like the scale figure on the left there. At the same time, there are other elements that create a distance, that pull us out of that scene and don't allow us to immerse ourselves in that world. We see the X-Acto knife right in the middle, which is way out of scale, the fact that the ground is a cutting mat. And so it's always keeping that distance of representation, not allowing it to be a direct illustration of some proposed reality. And I'm just going to go really quickly through a few more of these because I want to get to how this folded back into my teaching in the second year studios. Here we're seeing a junk drawer filled with all sorts of rocks that, again, Scott Lafferty worked on. This is a table full of models that Geneva Cincula worked on. And I should say, this was done during the height of the pandemic lockdown. And so for me, it was also cathartic to see all of these projects sharing space visually. They had been in my head together and sharing space on my hard drive, but because I didn't have access to much studio workspace at the time, having them share an image space was the next best thing. And pulling back to see the whole range of artifacts. This, I should say, is a scenographically constructed image. It's more of a stage set than anything. If you were to see this in top view, it would look very strange. There would be large gaps in between the models that are all in service of curating this frontal perspective you see here. And you can always pull further and further back to reveal more and more layers of the artifice. And so taking that kind of deep dive, just experimenting with representation through rendering software, then allowed me to think about what are the ways in which we are introducing rendering to second year students, and how can we be critical about how each of those changes your perspective as a designer. And so I'm going to show three very different approaches to rendering, all in the second year studios. The first is from a project that was developed by Craig Babe, Bud Schoenefeld, and myself, called Sequence of Scenes. And here it is more of an immersive approach to rendering, where the students are intended to create a sense of mood and atmosphere and to place you in a space. The translation comes in because none of these scenes exist in the same building. They're all completely separate Rhino files, and the students then have to imagine how one might move from one scene to another. These are by Jampe. There's an example from Ethan. You can see the different characteristics and the different qualities of space that are created through these. These might be the closest to a more traditional rendering approach, almost taking a photographer's approach to architecture and showing us various scenes. And we can contrast that with something like this. These are a set of renderings by Lorraine Hendrickson, and these look maybe more like drawings. They're not drawings. They didn't go through the all too familiar workflow of exporting from Rhino, opening it in Illustrator, sending it to Photoshop, and creating that whole chain of files along the way. These are straight out of V-Ray. If you look closely, you can see that they have lines, so it's rendering lines, which again we would associate with drawings, but it's doing it through an opacity map. If you're not familiar, an opacity map is basically a black and white image, and the software reads the black as completely transparent. It doesn't exist at all, and the white as completely solid. You can use grays, which produce translucency, but we were just using black and white in a grid, and you can change the size of that grid to change the legibility of those lines. Another example from Oz. This is from like a 1-hour workshop right at the beginning of a design project that was for a restaurant in residency. And for me, it was a really critical moment to see that rendering could be used as an integral part of the design process, not having it be, okay, we designed the building and the last step is to produce the renderings to sell the project to a jury or a client, but actually it becomes an iterative tool. And so the kind of colors here are probably corresponding to public and private space, or could have been cooking and eating space for the restaurant program. But this was the very first day of introducing that project and developing some diagrams. I said that I was going to return to this issue of scale, which I'm celebrating scale or ambiguity in an image like this. But again, for beginning design students, one of our tasks as instructors is to develop a sense of scale. In ARC 211, we've also decided to focus on materiality. And so when the pandemic hit and we had to switch everything to online teaching, we had this kind of two-pronged problem of having to introduce scale on the one hand and materiality all through Zoom. And the exercise that I developed in response to that was a precedent detail mockup. In practice, if you're not familiar, detail mockups are used very frequently to test material systems, whether it's kind of color of facade panels or testing for performance in water leaks and so forth. And they're usually not just one corner of a building. Oftentimes it's a Frankenstein of multiple pieces coming together to test as many different systems as possible. We took this mock-up, which usually anticipates a building, and used it retroactively to analyze precedents. And so these are looking at buildings that are already built and imagining what a mock-up might look like for that building, which required the students to look with a certain level of criticality at the details, at the joints, at the tectonics. So you might recognize some of the projects. This is obviously Scarpa, getting into texture mapping, the particular qualities of the marble, or Renzo piano. One of the funny things about doing it in this way is that oftentimes you have to exaggerate reality in order for it to read the way you want it to. So the grooves in the concrete there are probably larger than they would be in reality in order to generate an image that communicates that detail and that understanding of tectonics. Here's Lena Bobardi by Lubna. Arakawa and Gens, where the student is even putting the publications of Arakawa and Gens on the countertop there, introducing a mise-en-scene approach to this exercise. Or in Lorraine's example, we can see the intelligence of drawing making its way into rendering, where on the left we see something that resembles an elevation detail. Again, no lines are used here. This is all created through pixels, but it's absorbing the utility of certain drawings and thinking about how that can become part of a digital model to image production workflow. And then on the right, obviously, a worm's eye axonometric. And so I'll just kind of wrap up by sort of saying I'm being a little bit provocative in talking about a post-drawing era. I still believe very much in the utility of drawings. We still introduce drawing techniques to second year for no other reason that they're expected to know that in subsequent years and for practice currently. And so what I'm really trying to put on the table is the idea that as we increasingly use digital models and increasingly use rendering software as a supplement to drawing, is there a way that we can become critical about the uses of rendering? To think about it not necessarily accepting the immediacy that BIM allows, the immediacy, the relationship to a building, or that a photorealistic rendering software like Lumion might create, but instead thinking about ways in which we might produce value by porting over all of our expertise on representational translation that we developed around drawing, bringing that to the problem of image production. Thank you.